My name is Farah, and today, I am sharing a piece of my soul with you. Some stories are etched in ink, but this one was forged in the fire of betrayal and written with the tears of a woman who finally decided she had been silent for far too long. We often believe that our kindness is our greatest strength, but I learned the hard way that without boundaries, kindness is simply an invitation for others to rewrite your life. Before we dive into this journey of truth and reclamation, I want to take a moment to express my deepest, most humble gratitude to each and every one of you. Your presence here is not just a view to me. It is a heartbeat in our growing community. You are the reason I find the courage to tell these tales of empowerment. If this story touches your heart, or if you have ever felt the weight of being overshadowed, I invite you to subscribe to Queen's Revenge. It is a small gesture, but it helps us build a sanctuary for those who are learning to find their own light. And to those who have already joined our family and hit that subscribe button, may your lives be blessed with an overflowing abundance of wealth, and may your homes be filled with a happiness so profound that it radiates through everything you do. Thank you for believing in the power of truth. Now let us begin the day the silence finally broke. The air inside the Silverport Cathedral was thick with the scent of lilies and the ancient, sepulchral dust of centuries-old repentance. Light filtered through the towering stained glass saints, casting fractured prisms of amethyst and gold across the aisle, where I stood encased in ivory silk. This was supposed to be the sanctuary, the place where the chaotic threads of my life would finally be woven into a tapestry of permanence. Every detail was curated to perfection, the rhythmic hum of the organ, the weight of the heirloom lace against my skin, and the steady, unwavering gaze of Julian Thorne. Julian, with his granite jaw and eyes the color of a winter sea, held my hands with a grip that was less about affection and more about an unspoken pact. We were standing on the precipice of a new world, a fortress we had built to keep the madness out. The priest's voice was a low melodic drone, a ritualistic comfort that anchored me to the present. I felt the collective breath of Silverport's elite behind me, a sea of silk and pearls waiting for the final affirmation. But beneath the surface of my composure, there was a cold, sharp blade of anticipation. I wasn't just a bride waiting for a husband. I was a hunter waiting for the trap to spring. My heart didn't flutter with the nervous energy of a woman in love. It beat with the rhythmic precision of a ticking clock. I knew the silence of the cathedral was a lie. I knew the peace was merely a masquerade, a thin veneer of civility that was about to be torn asunder. Then it happened. The heavy oak portals at the rear of the cathedral didn't just open. They groaned as if the building itself were protesting the violation. The sound was cataclysmic, shattering the sacred hush like a stone through a mirror. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I could feel the sudden drop in temperature, the electric charge of a storm finally breaking. The gasps of the guests rose in a disorganized wave, a chaotic crescendo that drowned out the dying notes of the organ. Stop! Stop this wedding! The voice was a jagged blade, raw and desperate, vibrating with a frantic energy that felt entirely alien in this place of hushed reverence. I felt Julian's fingers tighten around mine, not in shock but in a signal. We had rehearsed this silence. We had anticipated this ruin. Slowly, with a deliberate haunting grace, I turned to face the intruder. Genevieve was a blood-red wound in a room made of bone-white lace. She stood in the center of the aisle, draped in a scandalous crimson gown that clung to her like a second skin, the color of fresh betrayal. Her hair was a wild halo of mahogany, and her eyes, wide and bloodshot, were fixed on Julian with a terrifying singular intensity. She looked like a tragic heroine from a forgotten opera, someone who had burned down her own house just to feel the heat. "He belongs to me, Farah," she screamed, her voice cracking under the weight of her own delusion. "You've stolen him just like you've stolen everything else. Julian, tell her. Tell them all that this is a mistake. You don't love her. You're just trapped in her shadow." The congregation was paralyzed, caught between the thrill of a scandal and the horror of the sacrilege. My mother, Eleanor, let out a strangled sob, her hand fluttering to her throat, while Alistair, my stepfather, stood frozen, his face a mask of ashen disbelief. They saw a daughter unraveling. I saw a parasite finally being forced into the light. Genevieve took a step forward, her heels clicking against the marble floor like the countdown to an explosion. "I have the proof, Julian. I've written it all down. Every moment we shared. Every look you gave me when she wasn't watching. You can't marry a lie. You can't marry a ghost. I watched her with a predatory patience. I didn't cry. I didn't tremble. I didn't let a single tear mar the perfect porcelain of my makeup. Instead, I let a smile, small, sharp, and terrifyingly calm, touch the corners of my lips. It was the smile of a woman who had spent years walking on eggshells, only to realize she was the one holding the hammer. "Genevieve," I said, my voice cutting through her hysterics with the chilling clarity of a winter bell. "You've always had a flair for the dramatic. You've spent your whole life trying to write yourself into my story, trying to steal the ink from my pen. But today the story ends. And I'm the one who gets to write the final chapter." Julian turned to me then, his face a calculated study of concern, a performance we had perfected over months of clandestine planning. He looked at Genevieve, then back to me, the silent question hanging in the air for the benefit of the audience. I reached into the hidden pocket of my voluminous silk skirt and pulled out a heavy ivory envelope. It felt weighted, laden with the gravity of years of silent suffering and secret discoveries. The cathedral fell into a deathly silence, the kind of silence that precedes a verdict. "You talk about proof, Genevieve," I continued, stepping down from the altar, the train of my dress hissing against the stone like a serpent. "You talk about your proof of Julian's love. But I have something much more substantial. I have your own voice. Not the one you use when you're pretending to be the victim, but the one you use in the dark when you think no one is listening." I pulled out the letter. Not a single sheet of paper, but a meticulously curated dossier of her most damning diary entries, printed in a font that screamed of her obsession. The paper felt crisp, a sharp contrast to the soft, blurred edges of her reality. "This," I said, holding the pages up for the front row to see, "is a chronicle of a soul in decay. It's a map of every lie you've told, every boy you've stolen, and every scheme you've hatched to dismantle my life. You didn't come here today for love, Genevieve. You came here because you couldn't stand that I finally found something you couldn't mimic." I looked at her, and for the first time, I saw the flicker of genuine terror in her eyes. The letter was the one thing she never expected me to find, the black leather journal she thought was buried in the wreckage of her vanity. "Shall I read the entry from 3 months ago?" I asked, my voice dropping to a whisper that echoed in the rafters. "The one where you detailed how you would wait for this exact moment to save Julian? Or perhaps the one from last week, where you described the red dress as the shroud for my happiness?" The gasp that rippled through the cathedral was the sound of 1,000 illusions shattering at once. The masquerade was over. The sanctuary had been breached, but it wasn't my marriage that was being destroyed. It was Genevieve's carefully constructed altar of lies. I stood in the wreckage of her reputation, taller than I had ever been, the predator finally reclaiming the narrative. I didn't need to scream. I didn't need to cry. I just needed her to see that the woman she tried to replace was the only one who truly knew how the story ended. Standing there at the altar, the weight of Genevieve's crimson presence still vibrating through the cathedral, I took a long, steadying breath. The scent of the lilies seemed to sharpen, pulling me back through the corridors of time to the house that was never quite a home. To understand the wreckage standing before me in red, one must understand the foundation upon which it was built. Growing up with Genevieve wasn't merely a series of childhood squabbles or the typical friction of a blended family. It was a slow-motion heist of my identity. It was a war of attrition fought in the quiet corners of the Alastair-Eleanor household, where the weapons were whispered lies and the casualties were my sense of self. When Alastair brought Genevieve into our lives, she arrived with a veneer of fragile perfection that immediately captivated my mother, Eleanor. She was the poor, motherless girl who needed extra care, a narrative she weaponized with chilling efficiency. To the outside world, we were the picture of Silverport aristocracy, but behind those manicured hedges, I was receiving a brutal survival education. I quickly learned that Genevieve was a moth drawn to any light I produced, not to bask in it, but to extinguish it. If I excelled in a painting class, she would accidentally spill turpentine on my canvas, while weeping about her own lack of talent. If I wore a dress that made me feel beautiful, she would borrow it and return it with a frayed hem, a silent testament to her parasitic need to diminish anything that belonged solely to me. This wasn't just about objects, it was about the air I breathed. She didn't just take my clothes, she took my peace. She studied my mannerisms, my inflections, and the way I tilted my head when I was deep in thought. It was a form of psychological machinations that left me feeling like a stranger in my own skin. I began to hide my joys, tucking my achievements away like illicit contraband. I learned to keep my face neutral to mask my excitement, because I knew that the moment Genevieve sensed my happiness, she would find a way to make it hers, or destroy it so it could never be mine again. This was the core of my childhood trauma. The realization that my own home was a theater of surveillance where my stepsister was the lead actress, the director, and the saboteur. The Alistair Eleanor household was a place of high expectations and low emotional safety. My mother, desperate to maintain the image of a perfect, unified family, often overlooked Genevieve's subtle cruelties, labeling them as adjustment issues. Alistair, blinded by his own guilt for uprooting his daughter, showered her with a level of indulgence that only fed her delusions of grandeur. In this vacuum of accountability, Genevieve's obsession with me grew from a childhood envy into a dark driving force. She didn't want to be my sister. She wanted to be my replacement. She wanted the life she thought I had inherited by some cosmic fluke, ignoring the fact that I worked for every scrap of success I achieved. The turning point, the moment that shifted her envy into a terminal obsession, happened on a night that was supposed to be mine alone. The Silverport Art Gala was the social event of the season, a glittering assembly of the city's power brokers and creative minds. Genevieve had been invited, of course, but a convenient flu, one of her many damsel in distress routines, had kept her confined to her bed. For once, I stepped into the light without the shadow of her presence looming over me. I wore a gown of midnight blue, a color that didn't scream for attention but commanded it. I felt a rare sense of liberation, a freedom from the constant vigilance that defined my daily life. It was there, under the vaulted ceilings of the Silverport Museum, that I met Julian Thorne. He wasn't just another name in a social register. He was a force of nature. Julian, the keynote speaker, spoke of educational reform with a passion that bypassed the cynical veneer of the elite. When our eyes met across the gallery, it wasn't the shallow spark of attraction. It was a recognition of shared purpose. We spent the evening lost in conversation, oblivious to the champagne-sipping crowds around us. He saw me, not the curated version of a Silverport debutante, but the woman who had built a tech startup from nothing but a vision and a stubborn refusal to be silenced. When I returned home that night, the air in the house felt different. I was glowing with a secret fire, a warmth that I couldn't entirely hide. Genevieve, recovered with suspicious speed, was waiting in the shadows of the hallway. She didn't say a word, but her eyes, dark and calculating, searched my face with a terrifying intensity. She knew something had changed. She could smell the scent of a joy she hadn't authorized. In the weeks that followed, as my relationship with Julian blossomed into something profound and undeniable, Genevieve's parasitic nature went into overdrive. She began to ask pointed questions about Julian, her voice a saccharine imitation of sisterly interest. What does he like, Farah? What does he look for in a woman? Does his mother, Lady Catherine, really approve of someone so self-made? She was gathering data, feeding her internal machinations, preparing for the moment she could swoop in and claim the prize she felt I had stolen from the universe's rightful order. She had missed the gala, but she spent the next year trying to recreate it. She bought a gown in the same shade of midnight blue. She began to read the same books on educational reform that Julian and I discussed. She even tried to mimic the way I laughed when Julian told a joke. But what she couldn't replicate was the authenticity of our connection. She could copy the melody, but she could never understand the soul of the song. My engagement to Julian was the ultimate provocation. To Genevieve, it wasn't a celebration of love. It was a personal insult. It was the final piece of my life that she felt entitled to. She didn't see Julian as a man. She saw him as the ultimate accessory, the crown jewel in the identity she was trying to steal. The childhood trauma of being constantly undermined had taught me to be observant, and I saw the shift in her. I saw the way her smile never reached her eyes when she congratulated us. I saw the way she looked at my engagement ring, not with admiration but with a cold, hungry greed. As I stood in the cathedral, looking at the wreckage of her in that red dress, I realized that her entire life had been a rehearsal for this failure. She had spent years perfecting the art of the theft, only to realize that some things cannot be stolen. The letter I held was the culmination of my own education, a testament to the fact that while she was busy trying to become me, I was busy becoming a woman she could never truly touch. The architect of my subtle ruin had finally built a monument to her own undoing, and I was simply the one who had invited the world to watch it crumble. The discovery occurred on a Tuesday afternoon that smelled of lemon wax and stale memories. 3 months after Julian had placed a ring of platinum and diamonds on my finger, I found myself back in the hollowed-out silence of the Alistair estate. My mother had asked for help clearing out the attic, a task that felt like an archaeological dig through the layers of a life I had spent years trying to outrun. It was there, pushed deep into the shadows behind Genevieve's old mahogany vanity, that I found it. A small, unassuming book bound in black leather. It looked like a discarded shadow, yet the moment my fingers brushed against its spine, a cold electric dread traveled up my arm. This was the black leather Pandora, and once I pried its cover open, the world as I knew it ceased to exist. As I opened the first page, the air in the cramped attic seemed to vanish. The prose didn't just sit on the paper. It vibrated with a manic, obsessive energy. The handwriting was a jagged, frantic script, ink-stained and erratic, as if the pen were struggling to keep pace with a mind that was rapidly accelerating toward a cliff. This wasn't a diary. It was a manifesto of a breaking mind. The first few pages were dated years ago, but as I flipped forward to the entries following my engagement, the tone shifted from mere resentment to a terrifying, calculated delusion. Genevieve had constructed a parallel universe in these pages, one where she was the guardian of Julian's soul, and I was the villainous usurper. Julian is drowning, one entry began. The ink bled through the page like a bruise. He thinks he's found a partner in Farah, but he's actually found a parasite. She's a charity case who got lucky, a girl from the gutters of Alistair's pity, who has managed to trick a thorn into a life of mediocrity. He looks at me during dinner, I know he does. He sees the grace she lacks. He sees the pedigree she's trying to buy with his name. I am the only one who can save him from the tragedy of this marriage. I will be the one to pull him from the wreckage she's building. The visceral reaction was a wave of nausea that settled deep in my bones. To read my own sister, the woman who had sat across from me at Christmas dinners and smiled during my engagement party, describe me as a charity case was a revelation that stripped away the last of my naivety. In her eyes, I wasn't a self-made woman who had built a company and earned my place. I was an intruder who had tricked my way into a life I didn't deserve. The delusion was so complete that she had convinced herself her theft would be an act of mercy. She didn't view her plan to stop the wedding as a crime. She viewed it as a holy crusade. I sat on the dusty floorboards, the light from the small attic window catching the sheen of the ink-stained pages. I read about her rehearsals. She had documented her practice sessions in front of the mirror, noting which angle of her chin would best convey a shattered but noble lover. She had written down the exact cadence of the words she would use to interrupt our vows. Stop the wedding. He belongs to me. She had even sketched the red dress I would later see in the cathedral, a garment she described as the shroud for Farah's lies. The level of detail was pathological. She had mapped out the seating charts of the guests, identifying who among the Silverport elite would be most susceptible to her performance, who would spread the scandal the fastest, and who would be the first to turn their backs on the charity case bride. The more I read, the more I realized that Genevieve was no longer living in our reality. She was a woman trapped in a house of mirrors of her own making, where every reflection told her she was the rightful queen and I was the jester. It was a revelation that brought a strange, icy clarity to my heart. For years, I had tried to apologize for my existence. I had tried to be smaller so she could feel bigger. I had navigated her moods like a sailor watching a volatile sea, always fearing the next storm. But the black leather Pandora told me that there was no storm to manage, only a shipwreck that had already happened. As I reached the final entry of that first volume, my hands were steady. The nausea had been replaced by a cold, predatory resolve. I looked at the vanity where she had sat for hours, brushing her hair and plotting my social execution. She was waiting for a reaction. She was waiting for me to find her accidentally left evidence, to scream, to cry, to call off the wedding in a fit of insecurity. That was her script. She wanted me to be the one to break so she could be the one to fix it. She wanted a confrontation that she could manipulate into a scene from a tragic romance. But I would not give her the satisfaction of a single word. I would not confront her with my hurt, nor would I offer her the grace of a warning. If she wanted to write a story of my ruin, I would let her. I would let her believe she was the hidden hand behind the curtain, the master puppeteer of our lives. I would play the role of the blushing, oblivious bride until the very last second. I would let her spend her father's money on that crimson dress. I would let her rehearse her lines until they were perfect. I would let her walk into that cathedral with her heart full of poison, believing she was about to take the throne. I stood up, the black leather book tucked under my arm like a weapon. I would not destroy her with an argument. I would destroy her with the truth of her own words. I would wait until the audience was at its largest, until the stage was set, and then I would hand her the mirror she had worked so hard to avoid. I would let Genevieve write her own ending, and I would make sure it was a tragedy that Silverport would never forget. I replaced the vanity as it was, leaving the shadows undisturbed, and walked out of the room. The charity case was about to become the most expensive mistake she ever made. The request came wrapped in a saccharine smile and a voice that trembled with a manufactured vulnerability. Genevieve stood in the sun-drenched parlor of the Alastair estate, her hands clasped tightly as she begged, not just asked but begged, to be my maid of honor. She spoke of healing our rift, of honoring our shared history, and of standing by her sister's side on the most important day of her life. It was a masterpiece of duplicity, a performance so polished it would have brought a less informed audience to tears. My mother, Eleanor, beamed with a tragic hope, her eyes pleading with me to accept this olive branch. I looked at Genevieve, seeing not a sister, but a serpent coiled in silk, and I felt a surge of cold, exhilarating stoicism. Of course, Genevieve, I had said, my voice a steady anchor in the sea of her false emotion. I couldn't imagine anyone else standing there. With that single sentence, the stage was set for an orchestration of a different kind. By inviting her into the inner sanctum of the wedding preparations, I wasn't giving her access. I was placing her under a microscope. I became the perfectly oblivious bride, a woman so blinded by her own happiness that she couldn't see the wolf in the sheep's clothing. But beneath the tulle and the floral arrangements, I was a silent observer, maintaining a level of surveillance that was as meticulous as it was invisible. Every time she accidentally spilled red wine near my Vera Wang gown, every time she whispered a poisonous lie to the caterers about my supposed difficult temperament, I recorded it. Not with a camera, but with a cold steel-trap memory and a hidden digital recorder that captured the hushed vitriol she shared with her few remaining allies. I watched her perform sisterly love at the cake tastings, her fingers fluttering over the fondant while she pointedly suggested flavors she knew Julian found repulsive. I watched her help with the seating charts, strategically placing my most supportive friends in the dark corners of the cathedral, while positioning herself as the central figure of the bridal party. To the world, she was the devoted sister, sacrificing her own time to ensure my day was perfect. To me, she was a woman digging her own grave with a golden shovel, enchanted by the sound of her own shovel hitting the dirt. What Genevieve never suspected, what her arrogance would never allow her to conceive, was that Julian was not the oblivious prize she believed him to be. In the quiet hours of the night, away from the prying eyes of the Alastair household, Julian and I transformed from a couple in love into a unit of counterintelligence. He wasn't a victim of her charms. He was the primary witness to her unraveling. We would sit in the library of the Thorne estate, the glow of the fireplace illuminating the latest revelations from her diaries and the logs of her daily sabotages. "She's practicing again," Julian would say, his voice tight with a mixture of disgust and disbelief. He had installed a discreet baby monitor in the guest room where Genevieve stayed during the final weeks of the orchestration. We would listen to the tinny, distorted audio of her voice as she stood before her mirror, reciting the Stop the Wedding speech. It was haunting to hear her try on different emotions like they were accessories: anguish, righteous fury, heartbroken betrayal. She was fine-tuning the destruction of my reputation, unaware that she was providing us with the script for her own social execution. "She actually believes this will work," I whispered one night, leaning my head against Julian's shoulder. "She thinks that by wearing that red dress and screaming those words, the world will suddenly see her as the protagonist and me as the mistake. She's living in a fantasy of her own creation, Farah," Julian replied, his grip on my hand like iron. She's so focused on the crescendo of her performance that she's ignored the foundation of the reality we've built. Let her keep digging. The deeper the hole, the harder it will be for her to ever climb out. My stoicism became my greatest weapon. I allowed her to ruin the floral arrangements, only to have my secret team fix them an hour later. I allowed her to spread rumors that I was marrying Julian for his title, knowing that Lady Catherine Thorne already held the evidence of Genevieve's own financial desperation. I played the role of the stressed, distracted bride, occasionally confiding in Genevieve about my insecurities, feeding her just enough false information to keep her schemes focused exactly where I wanted them. I watched her eyes light up with a cruel triumph every time she thought she had dealt a blow to my composure. The duplicity was exhausting, a constant mental gymnastics of maintaining the facade while tracking her every move. There were moments when the childhood trauma threatened to resurface, when her whispers triggered the old hollow ache of being the lesser daughter. But then I would look at the black leather diary, or I would see the steady, supporting gaze of Julian, and the pain would crystallize into a cold, hard resolve. I wasn't just surviving her anymore, I was outmaneuvering her. As the wedding day approached, the air in the Alastair house grew heavy with the unspoken tension of two conflicting narratives. Genevieve was vibrating with a manic energy, her movements sharp and erratic. She was a woman possessed by the vision of her own justice. I, on the other hand, moved with a deliberate, haunting calm. I was the architect of the silence that follows a storm. I made sure every detail of her surveillance was backed up, every diary entry transcribed, every accident documented. The night before the ceremony, I walked past her room and heard the familiar, rhythmic murmur of her rehearsal. "He belongs to me. I can't let this travesty continue." I didn't feel fear. I didn't even feel anger. I felt a profound, chilling pity for the woman who was so consumed by her hatred of me that she had forgotten how to exist outside of it. She was the maid of honor, the woman chosen to hold my bouquet and smooth my train. Yet she was the one holding the match that would ignite her own pyre. I went to my own room and looked out at the Silverport skyline. The orchestration was complete. The trap was set, not with malice, but with a clinical necessity to protect the life I had fought so hard to build. Tomorrow Genevieve would make her grand entrance. She would wear her scandalous crimson and scream her jagged words. And I would stand there, encased in the ivory silk of my own truth, and watch as the golden shovel finally struck the bedrock of her own undoing. The night before the wedding, the Alastair estate was a hollow shell of itself, breathing with the rhythmic, uneasy sigh of a house that knew it held a secret. I moved through the corridors like a specter, my bare feet silent against the cold marble, drawn by a magnetic, morbid curiosity to the room that housed my sister's decaying mind. The house was supposed to be asleep, draped in the heavy velvet of midnight, but the air felt charged, vibrating with a low-frequency hum of impending disaster. I reached the vanity once more, my fingers trembling only slightly as I retrieved the black leather book. When I opened it, the scent of fresh ink hit me, a sharp metallic odor that stung the nostrils. The final entry was there, the script more erratic than ever, the loops of her letters bleeding into one another as if they were trying to escape the page. The ink was still wet, a dark, glistening smear that looked like a fresh wound. "Tomorrow is not just a ceremony, it is a reckoning," she had written, the pressure of her pen nearly tearing through the paper. "I have seen the future in the mirror. The red dress is not merely fabric. It is a symbol of prophetic justice. It is my destiny." While Farah walks toward the altar in her pale, pathetic shroud of white, I will be the blood that wakes the world up. The color of passion, the color of truth. By noon, the name Thorne will belong to the woman who actually possesses the soul to match it. She thinks she is winning. She thinks her silence is strength. She has no idea that she is walking into a trap of her own making. I stared at the word destiny until it blurred into a dark blotch. There was a terrifying irony in her words. She believed she was the one setting the trap, unaware that I was the one who had provided the floorboards for her to stand on. This entry was the final piece of the mosaic, the ultimate proof of her premeditated intent to dismantle my life in the most public forum possible. I closed the book, the wet ink leaving a faint dark ghost of itself on the opposite page. A perfect metaphor for Genevieve's entire existence. A smear on someone else's story. The morning of the wedding dawned not with a triumphant sun, but with a heavy silver mist that rolled off the coast of Silverport, cloaking the city in a shroud of looming uncertainty. Inside the house, the atmosphere was frantic. Stylists, florists, and bridesmaids swirled in a cacophony of silk and hairspray, their voices a jagged edge of nervous energy. My mother was a whirlwind of anxieties, her hands fluttering like trapped birds as she fussed over the lace of my veil. Amidst this storm of activity, Genevieve was a masterpiece of controlled mania. She was everywhere, her eyes bright with a feverish light, her movements quick and jerky. She was overacting the role of the devoted maid of honor, her voice a pitch too high, her laughter a shade too sharp. "You look beautiful, Farah," she whispered as she helped me into my bodice, her cool fingers grazing my skin like a threat. "Truly a vision. I just hope you're ready for everything today brings." "I am, Genevieve," I replied, meeting her gaze in the mirror. I didn't see the jitters of a bride in my own eyes. I saw the cold, calculated focus of a general surveying the battlefield. I've never been more ready for a day in my life. I felt a strange sense of eerie calm, a psychological anticipation that was devoid of fear. While the women around me fretted over misplaced hairpins or the wilted edge of a peony, I was mentally reviewing my dossier. I knew exactly which page of the diary I would read first. I knew the exact cadence I would use to silence her. I knew the layout of the cathedral like a tactical map, identifying the points where her voice would carry the best, and where the cameras of the social press would be positioned to capture her fall. I wasn't just getting married, I was executing a maneuver. As we were ushered into the limousines, the looming shadow of the Silverport Cathedral began to dominate the skyline. It sat atop the hill like a stone titan, its Gothic spires piercing the gray mist. For Genevieve, it was the stage for her grandest performance, the place where she would finally ascend. For me, it was the kill box. I sat in the back of the car, the heavy silk of my dress pooling around me like a white sea, and I felt the weight of the ivory envelope hidden within my skirts. It was my shield, my sword, and my witness. The anticipation in the air was thick enough to taste, a metallic tang of copper and ozone. As we arrived at the cathedral, the crowd of photographers and onlookers surged forward, their flashes firing in a rhythmic, blinding staccato. I watched Genevieve through the tinted glass. She was staring at the cathedral doors with a hunger that was almost primal. She wasn't looking at a church, she was looking at a throne. She believed the prophetic entries in her diary were about to become reality, that the universe was finally tilting back in her favor. Inside the vestry, the final moments before the procession were a blur of hushed whispers and the scent of incense. The organ began to groan, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the floorboards and settled in my chest. This was the crescendo I had been preparing for. I looked at myself in the full-length mirror. A woman in white, the perfect image of a blissful, vulnerable bride. It was the ultimate masquerade. My happiness was the bait, the shining, irresistible lure that would draw the predator out of the shadows and into the light of public scrutiny. "It's time," the coordinator whispered. I stepped into the narthex, the cold air of the cathedral washing over me. Julian was waiting at the end of that long floral-lined aisle, his face a mask of solemn resolve. He knew. We were the only two people in this vast, ornate space who knew that the ceremony was merely the prologue to the real event. Genevieve took her place in front of me, her back straight, her head held high. I could see the tension in her shoulders, the frantic energy she was trying so hard to suppress. She was a coiled spring ready to snap. The doors groaned open. The light spilled in, and the congregation rose in a unified wave of rustling silk. I took my first step, the train of my dress a heavy ivory wake behind me. The organ reached a triumphant peak, but all I could hear was the ticking of the clock in my head. 10 minutes. 5 minutes. 3. I wasn't a bride walking toward her husband. I was a hunter walking toward the trap. Every step was a countdown. Every breath was a preparation. I knew exactly when she would do it. I knew the exact moment her destiny would demand to be heard. And as I reached the altar and felt Julian's hand close over mine, I looked at Genevieve one last time. She was smiling, a small secret smirk that told me she thought she had already won. She had no idea that I had memorized her script better than she had. She had no idea that the charity case had spent the morning sharpening the very words that would cut the ground from beneath her feet. The countdown was over. The chaos was about to begin. And I, the general in white, was ready to lead her into the ruin she had so meticulously planned for me. The air in the Silverport Cathedral had reached a point of absolute, crushing stillness, the kind of silence that exists only in the eye of a hurricane. Genevieve stood before me, a vibrant bleeding slash of crimson against the sacred white of the altar, her chest heaving with the weight of her own audacity. She looked out at the 500 faces of Silverport's elite, her eyes shimmering with the expectation of a standing ovation for her bravery. She truly believed this was her moment of cinematic triumph, the scene where the rightful queen reclaims her throne from the usurper. But as I stepped forward, the train of my ivory silk gown whispering a final, sharp warning against the stone, the atmosphere began to shift from shock to a cold, clinical exposé. I reached into the hidden folds of my skirt and retrieved the envelope. It was not a weapon made of steel, but something far more lethal. It was a mirror. "You speak of truth, Genevieve," I began, my voice amplified by the cathedral's vaulted arches, steady and devoid of the tremor she so desperately craved. "You speak of Julian as if he were a prize you lost in a game of chance. But Julian is not a prize, and this is not a game. This is a tragedy of your own authorship." I opened the envelope, pulling out the curated pages, the distilled essence of her black leather diaries. I didn't look at her. I looked at the congregation, at the Thorne family in the front row, and at the socialites who had already begun to trade whispers. "You want the truth? Then let us hear it in your own words. Not the ones you've rehearsed for this theater, but the ones you wrote in the dark, when you thought the world was blind to your malice." I began to read. I didn't rush. I allowed every word to hang in the incense-laden air, a slow and deliberate drip of poison. I read the entry where she described me as a charity case, who had stolen the life meant for her. I read the passages where she detailed her systematic attempts to alienate my friends, her parasitic mimicry of my passions, and her cold-blooded calculations regarding the Thorne fortune. The gasps that rippled through the pews were not for me, but for the sheer, naked depravity of her obsession. This was the ultimate humiliation, a public flaying of her soul before the very society she had spent a lifetime trying to impress. The physical transformation of Genevieve was a sight of chilling beauty. The triumphant, radiant glow of the heroine began to crack. Her shoulders, once set with the arrogance of a conqueror, began to hunch. Her face, painted with the perfection of a porcelain doll, turned a sickly, ashen gray. She wasn't a queen anymore. She was a cornered animal, realizing for the first time that the walls of the trap weren't closing in on me. They were her own. The red dress, which she had intended as a symbol of destiny, now looked like a costume from a failed play, a garish and pathetic cry for attention that had finally been silenced by the truth. "And then," I continued, my voice dropping to a low, lethal murmur that carried to every corner of the nave, "we have the entry from last night, the one where you planned this exact moment. You wrote about the crescendo of your performance. You wrote about how the blood red of your gown would drown out the pathetic white of mine. You didn't come here to save Julian, Genevieve. You came here to destroy me. But in your haste to burn down my life, you forgot that you were standing in the middle of the flame." The shattering was nearly audible. I could see the exact moment the last of her delusions crumbled. Her eyes, once fixed on Julian with a predatory hunger, now darted frantically around the room, finding only disgust and pity in the eyes of her peers. Even Alistair, her own father, turned his head away, unable to look at the monster he had helped create through his own indulgence. The social standing she had cultivated so carefully, the invitations, the accolades, the veneer of elegance, evaporated in the heat of her own documented hatred. She was being erased in real time, her identity dissolving into the ink-stained revelations of her own hand. "Julian never belonged to you," I said, finally turning to look her directly in the eyes. I saw the hollow, terrifying void behind them, the space where a real person should have been. "He belongs to a woman who doesn't need to steal a life to have one. He belongs to the truth. And you? You belong to the shadows you've spent so many years inhabiting." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a tomb. Genevieve tried to speak, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, but no sound came out. The jagged blade of her voice had been blunted by the sheer weight of her own words. Then the first sob broke through, a ragged, ugly sound that had none of the grace of her rehearsed tears. It was the sound of a total and irrevocable breakdown. She looked at Julian, one last, desperate plea for a rescue that would never come. He didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He looked through her as if she were made of glass, a ghost that had finally been exorcised. Then came the exodus. Genevieve turned and ran. She didn't walk with the dignity of a tragic figure. She stumbled, her heavy crimson skirts tangling around her legs, her heels clicking a frantic, disorganized rhythm against the marble. She reached the great oak doors, the same one she had breached with such arrogance only minutes before, and threw them open. The gray Silverport mist swallowed her whole, her red dress disappearing into the fog like a dying ember. The heavy thud of the doors closing behind her was the final period on a sentence that had taken 20 years to write. I stood there at the altar, the ivory pages of her ruin still in my hand. I felt the warmth of Julian's fingers as they threaded through mine, a grounding, solid reality. I looked at the 500 guests, who were now shifting in their seats, unsure of how to proceed in the wake of such a cataclysm. My mother was weeping, Alistair was broken, and the Thorn matriarch, Lady Catherine, gave me a single imperceptible nod of approval. I had protected the family. I had protected myself. But most importantly, I listened. The frantic ringing in my ears, the years of whispered threats and subtle sabotages, the constant noise of Genevieve's envy, it was all gone. The silence that filled the cathedral was not empty. It was rich, resonant, and profound. It was the sound of a life finally belonging to itself. As the organist, with a trembling hand, began to play a soft, tentative melody to signal the resumption of the ceremony, I realized that I had been wrong before. This wasn't the sound of a storm ending. This was the most beautiful music of my life, the sound of a clean slate. The Maldives were supposed to be the antidote to the poison, a paradise of liquid turquoise and sands so white they felt like a dream of purity. Following the cataclysm at the cathedral, Julian and I had fled to a private overwater villa, seeking the kind of silence that isn't heavy with secrets, but light with the promise of a beginning. For 3 days the world was nothing but the rhythmic pulse of the Indian Ocean and the steady, grounding warmth of Julian's presence. But the shadows of Silverport were long, and they had a way of stretching across oceans. On the 4th morning a package arrived via a discreet courier, a heavy manila envelope that sat on our mahogany breakfast table like a dormant explosive. There was no return address, only a note from a former associate of the Alistair family, someone who had seen the exposé and decided the truth deserved its full, terrifying completion. Inside was not another leather-bound diary, but a professional dossier, the private investigator logs. And it was here that we discovered the true, chilling depth of Genevieve's espionage. As I unfurled the documents, the sunlight reflecting off the ocean seemed to lose its warmth. This wasn't just the rambling of a jealous sister. This was a meticulous, clinical operation. Genevieve had not merely been watching me. She had been dissecting me. The dossier contained months of target activity logs, spreadsheets that documented my life with a surgical precision that made my skin crawl. Every morning at 7:05 a.m., I entered my favorite cafe. Every evening at 6:45 p.m., I left the office. She had paid off the service staff at the Thorn estate to report on our private conversations. She had hired low-level tech mercenaries to hack my business emails, not for corporate secrets, but to study my syntax, my tone, and the way I negotiated the world. It was a total and absolute breach of privacy, a subterranean invasion that transformed my most mundane moments into data points for her grand delusion. Julian sat beside me, his face hardening into a mask of cold fury as he read the reports of the hired help she had subverted. "She didn't just want a seat at the table, Farah," he whispered, his voice vibrating with a dark resonance. "She wanted to own the room. She was tracking the frequency of our calls, the restaurants we frequented, even the specific brand of perfume you wore." He pointed to a section titled Mimicry Integration Phase 3. It was a list of my habits, how I took my coffee, the way I crossed my legs during meetings, the specific cadence of my laughter, followed by Genevieve's notes on her own progress in replicating them. It was the documentation of a parasitic soul attempting to override its host. This was the most chilling realization of all. Genevieve wasn't truly in love with Julian. Her interest in him was merely a footnote in her obsession with me. To her, Julian was the ultimate validation of the Farah brand, The crown jewel that proved the life she was trying to steal was worth the effort. She viewed my life not as a human existence, but as a script, a prestigious role that I had somehow tricked the universe into giving me. She believed that if she could just perfect the audition, if she could master my mannerisms, wear my costumes, and speak my lines, she could simply step into my place and the world wouldn't know the difference. She saw me as an actress who was miscast in her own life, and she was the understudy waiting in the wings with a knife, ready to take the lead. The depth of her espionage revealed a psyche that had entirely abandoned the concept of self. She had spent so much energy on this meticulous surveillance that there was nothing left of the original Genevieve. Every folder we opened revealed a new layer of her erasure. There were transcripts of her practicing my business pitches, notes on the childhood stories I had shared with Julian, and even a log of the books I had checked out from the library. She was trying to build a bridge into my mind stone by stone, through a relentless campaign of psychological theft. It was a form of spiritual identity, theft that felt more violent than any physical assault. I realized then that the childhood trauma I had endured, the subtle sabotages and the borrowed clothes, had been merely the elementary school of her madness. She had graduated into a full-scale covert operation. As I sat there, the ivory pages of the dossier fluttering in the sea breeze, I analyzed the mind of a woman who could do this. How hollow must a person be to find satisfaction only in the reflection of someone else's light? She had turned my life into a series of timed routines and strategic points of entry. She had mapped out my vulnerabilities not to comfort me but to exploit them. She had sat in my shadow for 20 years, not out of a lack of opportunity, but because she was too busy measuring the height of my silhouette to ever stand in her own sun. The red dress at the wedding hadn't been an impulse. It had been the closing statement of a 6-month campaign of espionage that she believed would result in her total victory. She thought she could win the life by winning the man, I said, my voice echoing the profound pity I felt. But Julian, she didn't realize that a life isn't just a collection of habits and assets. It's the history, the struggle, and the authenticity that she could never hack into. She could copy my emails, but she could never feel the weight of the work I put into them. She could buy my perfume, but she could never understand the memories attached to the scent. Julian closed the dossier, the heavy thud of the paper sounding like a finality. She's a ghost, Farah. A ghost trying to inhabit a living body. But the more she tried to become you, the more she vanished. There's nothing left of her now but these logs and a trail of broken trust. He took my hand, his grip a solid reality-defining force. We're going to bury this. We're going to take every scrap of this filth and hand it over to the legal team. This isn't just a family feud anymore. It's a criminal breach of privacy. We're going to ensure she can never get close enough to see the color of your eyes again. The sunset that evening was a bruised purple and gold, a beautiful violent end to the day. I looked out at the horizon and realized that while Genevieve had been busy recording my life, I had been busy living it. She had the data, the routines, and the scripts, but I had the heartbeat. I had the man who saw through her masquerade before it even began. The detective's journal was meant to be the manual for my replacement, but instead, it became the final evidence of her obsolescence. We would return to Silverport not as victims of her surveillance, but as the authors of a narrative she was no longer permitted to read. The sun dipped below the water, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel the phantom weight of her eyes on my back. The surveillance had ended because the subject had finally outgrown the frame. 6 months had bled into the calendar, yet the air in Silverport remained saturated with the lingering scent of our cathedral reckoning. The scandal hadn't merely faded. It had fermented into a fine, potent vintage that the social elite sipped with a mixture of horror and fascination. Julian and I had settled into a life of quiet, fortified bliss, but the private investigator logs from our honeymoon remained locked in our library safe. A constant, silent reminder that a predator doesn't always die when her camouflage is stripped. Sometimes, she just retreats into deeper shadows. Genevieve had been sent abroad to a wellness retreat in the Alps, a gilded exile funded by a repentant Alistair. The reports filtering back suggested a woman transformed, a soul seeking penance through art and isolation. But I knew the architecture of her mind too well. I knew that for Genevieve, silence was rarely a sign of peace. It was the quiet before the next orchestration. We decided it was time to test the foundations of this supposed new life. We needed to know if the serpent had shed its skin or merely grown a thicker one. Thus, we began to weave the velvet trap. It was a campaign of strategic misinformation, a delicate tapestry of lies designed to look like the fraying edges of a perfect marriage. We didn't want to destroy her. We wanted to see if she would attempt to destroy us the moment she perceived a weakness. If she was truly redeemed, she would offer a prayer for our reconciliation. If she was still the architect of our ruin, she would see our pain as her golden opportunity. The performance began at the annual Silverport Yacht Club Regatta, a venue where every whisper is amplified by the salt air and the high society echo chamber. Julian and I arrived in separate cars, a detail we knew would be logged by the gossip columnists before the first sail was even raised. Throughout the evening we maintained a cold, professional distance. We staged a dispute on the terrace, timed perfectly for when Genevieve's most loyal informant, a socialite named Beatrice with a tongue like a viper, was within earshot. I practiced the art of the shattered bride, allowing my eyes to look hollow, my smiles to be brittle things that broke at the slightest pressure. I let a few carefully chosen words slip about irreconcilable differences and the burden of the Thorn legacy. This was psychological warfare at its most refined. We were feeding her the very narrative she had spent years trying to write, the failure of the charity case to keep the prince. We were providing the bait, a shimmering, irresistible lure of a crumbling marriage that would call to her deepest, most parasitic instincts. To the outside world, we were a couple on the brink of a spectacular collapse. In private, Julian and I would collapse into each other's arms in the back of the car, laughing with a dark, defiant joy at how well we were playing the game she had taught us. "She took the bait," Julian whispered one evening, showing me a digital notification. Genevieve's social media, previously a desert of authentic landscapes and art therapy sketches, had suddenly begun to show signs of life. She was liking posts about Silverport events. She was reaching out to Beatrice under the guise of concern. The breadcrumbs of my supposed misery were being gathered, and the hunger in her digital footprint was palpable. It was chilling to realize that her redemption was as thin as the mountain air she breathed. As part of the misinformation campaign, I began to be seen in public without my engagement ring, my hand looking strangely naked and vulnerable in the flashes of the paparazzi. We leaked rumors through our staff, the very people Genevieve had once bribed, about separate bedrooms and visits to high-profile divorce attorneys. Every move was a calculated piece of a larger performance. I felt like an actress in a tragedy, but the stakes were my real life. There was a hollow ache in my chest as I realized that to catch a monster, I had to become a master of the very duplicity I loathed. But this wasn't an act of malice, it was an act of preservation. The psychological warfare intensified when we announced a period of reflection, where I would remain in Silverport while Julian traveled to London for an extended business venture. In reality, we were together every night, but the world saw a woman abandoned. We wanted to see if Genevieve would break her exile. We wanted to see if the Stop the Wedding girl was still waiting in the wings, ready to swoop in and comfort the man she believed was her destiny. The response was swift and predictable. Within 48 hours of Julian's departure, Alistair received a call. Genevieve was coming home. She claimed she was concerned for the family's reputation and felt she should be there to support her sister through this difficult time. The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. The woman who had tried to set fire to my wedding was now returning to act as the cooling rain on my parched life. As I sat in our library, the velvet trap nearing its conclusion, I looked at the black leather diary one last time. Genevieve had written that I was a charity case who couldn't handle the Thorn world. Now, she was returning to Silverport, convinced that her prediction had come true. She was coming back not as a sister, but as a scavenger, ready to feast on the wreckage of a marriage we had built to be unbreakable. The final stage of the performance was set for the Winchester Foundation Gala, the same venue where her first obsession had taken root. We knew she would be there, draped in her newfound authenticity, waiting for the perfect moment to approach the broken wife and the available husband. The trap was set, the bait was taken, and the psychological warfare was reaching its final decisive battle. I stood before the mirror, the same one where I had once seen a vulnerable bride, and I saw a woman who had finally mastered the art of the counterstrike. "She's here." Julian's voice came over the encrypted line, a low, steady rumble of anticipation. She just walked in. She's wearing a dress that's remarkably similar to yours, Farah. Only, it's a darker shade. Like a bruise. Let the final act begin, I replied, my voice a cold, sharp blade. I walked into the gala, the flashes of the cameras blinding me for a moment. I saw her across the room, Genevieve, looking radiant in her false redemption, her eyes searching for the cracks in my armor. She didn't realize that the armor wasn't cracked. It was the trap she was about to step into. The velvet trap was about to close, and this time, there would be no escape through the cathedral doors. The daughter of Silverport was about to learn that when you play with the truth eventually plays back. The Silverport Foundation Gala was a cathedral of glass and ego, where the air hummed with the staccato of champagne flutes and the rustle of five-figure silks. Beneath the crystalline chandeliers, the city's elite moved like pieces on a chessboard, blissfully unaware that the game had already been won. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of gardenias and the electric, jagged thrill of scandal. I stood on the periphery, encased in a gown of shimmering charcoal, a shadow among the glittering lights. Julian was across the room, the center of gravity as always, playing his part in our grand performance of marital decay with a chilling, masterful precision. He looked weary, his gaze distant, the perfect picture of a man whose heart had been hollowed out by the charity case, bride who had supposedly failed him. It was the perfect stage for a ghost to manifest. Then the doors opened and the room seemed to tilt. Genevieve entered, not as the disgraced exile who had fled the cathedral in tears, but as a resurrected vision of authentic grace. She was draped in a gown of deep violet, the color of a fading bruise, that moved around her like liquid smoke. Her hair was swept back in a style that was a haunting, meticulous replica of the one I had worn on my wedding day. She didn't scurry, she glided, her chin tilted at the exact angle of noble suffering. She was the ghost of the gala, a specter of the woman she thought I used to be. The whispers began immediately, a low-frequency hum of recognition and judgment that she absorbed like oxygen. She truly believed the velvet trap had succeeded, that the cracks in my marriage were wide enough for her to slip through and finally claim the light. I watched from the shadows of the mezzanine, my fingers tracing the worn edges of the childhood diaries I held against my chest. These were not the black leather manifestos of her adult madness. These were the blueprints. They were the notebooks I had found hidden behind the false panel in her room. Pages of my childhood homework assignments she had traced, my signature practiced 1,000 times in the margins, lists of my favorite colors and books with notes on how to adopt them. This was the long-form documentation of a lifelong mimicry. As I watched her weave through the crowd toward Julian, her movements a practiced ballet of sympathetic sister, I felt a profound icy calm. This was not a confrontation of anger. It was a confrontation of reality. Genevieve reached Julian during a quiet moment on the terrace, the moonlight casting long, dramatic shadows across the stone. She approached him with the same rehearsed grace she had used years ago. A hand placed lightly on his arm, a tilt of the head that suggested a shared, secret understanding. I could see her lips moving, no doubt offering her deepest sympathies for our crumbling union, her voice likely a saccharine imitation of my own. She was performing the ultimate audition, stepping into the space she believed I had vacated. She was a scavenger at the feast of my supposed misery. I stepped out from the shadows of the French doors, the charcoal silk of my dress catching the moonlight. The silence that followed my entrance was not like the one in the cathedral. It was sharper, a vacuum of sound that pulled the air from the terrace. Genevieve froze, her hand still resting on Julian's sleeve, her face a mask of perfectly curated shock. For a moment we stood in a tableau of our own history, the bride, the groom, and the shadow. "You've always been so fond of the classics, Genevieve," I said, my voice a low, lethal hum that sliced through the night air. The gala, the moonlit terrace, the rehearsed speech of comfort. It's a beautiful mimicry, truly. But the problem with ghosts is that they only exist in the absence of light. Julian stepped away from her, his face shedding the mask of weariness instantly. He moved to my side, his presence a solid, unshakable wall. The look he gave Genevieve was not one of pity or longing. It was the cold, clinical gaze of a man looking at a specimen. "Farah," Genevieve stammered, her authentic veneer beginning to fracture. I was just telling Julian how sorry I am. I heard the rumors, and I wanted to be here for the family." "The rumors we planted?" I interrupted, stepping closer until I could see the frantic pulse in her neck. The trouble we staged? You didn't come here for the family, Genevieve. You came because you thought the role of Farrahthorne was finally open for casting. You came because you're still trying to audition for a life that isn't yours. I held up the childhood diaries, the fragile yellowed pages fluttering in the breeze. I found these, Genevieve. I found the traces of my own handwriting in your notebooks from when we were 10. I found the lists of my habits you practiced before you even knew who Julian Thorne was. This isn't about love. It's never been about love. Genevieve reached for the books, a flash of her old, jagged fury crossing her face, but she stopped herself, her eyes darting to the guests who were now watching from the doorway. She was trapped in the very society she so desperately wanted to lead. Her defeat was not a loud, crashing thing. It was a silent, internal shattering. You don't want Julian, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a verdict. You never did. He was just the most expensive piece of furniture in the house you were trying to steal. You don't want a husband. You just want to be the version of me that Julian loves. You've spent 20 years trying to wear my skin, hoping that if you copied me perfectly enough, the world would forget that you don't actually exist. The look in her eyes then was the most hollow thing I had ever seen. It was the look of a person who had looked into the mirror and finally saw that there was no one behind the reflection. The mimicry had been so complete that there was no Genevieve left to save. She was a collection of stolen habits and rehearsed smiles, a beautiful violet-clad shell standing on a terrace in a city that had finally seen through the glass. Go home, Genevieve, I said softly, the weight of the diaries feeling lighter in my hands. Not to the Alps and not to Alistair's house. Go somewhere where there are no mirrors. Go somewhere where you don't have a script. Because as long as you're trying to be me, you will always be a ghost in your own life. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply turned away, her movements no longer graceful, but stiff and disorganized. She walked past the silent, judging eyes of Silverport's elite, her bruise-colored dress disappearing into the darkness of the gardens. The defeat was absolute because it was undeniable. She hadn't been exposed for her crimes. She had been exposed for her emptiness. Julian wrapped his arm around my waist, his heart beating a steady, real rhythm against my shoulder. The ghost of the gala was gone, and the silence that remained was finally truly ours. I looked down at the childhood diaries and realized that I didn't need to keep them anymore. The archives of her obsession were closed. The hollow echo of her envy had finally faded, replaced by the authentic, unscripted breath of a woman who no longer had to hide her light. Chapter 10: The Art of Becoming. Time, I have found, is a master lapidary. It takes the jagged, unrefined edges of our most violent memories and grinds them down until they become something smooth, something translucent, something we can finally hold up to the light without cutting our hands. It has been 5 years since the ghost of the gala vanished into the Silverport mist, and the world that once vibrated with the frequency of Genevieve's obsession has settled into a profound, generative silence. I no longer wake up wondering if my reflection in the mirror belongs to me, nor do I check the shadows for the shimmer of a predatory crimson dress. Julian and I have built a life defined not by the walls we erected to keep others out, but by the gardens we have planted to invite the world in. Yet, the most startling revelation of this decade did not come from my own success, but from a small sun-drenched village in the heart of the French countryside, where the woman who tried to steal my soul finally found her own. Genevieve's redemption did not arrive with a fanfare or a public apology. It arrived in the form of a package containing a single unframed canvas. There were no traces of my style in the brushstrokes, no echo of the Farrah brand in the composition. It was a chaotic, beautiful explosion of ochre and violet, an original expression of a mind that had finally stopped looking outward for a map. Along with the painting was a letter from her therapist in Provence, detailing a journey that was less about fixing a broken woman and more about excavating a buried one. Genevieve had spent 3 years in deep, agonizing isolation, stripped of the Silverport finery and the Alistair name. She had lived in a cottage where the only mirrors were the ones she used to study the anatomy of her own grief. It was there, amidst the scent of lavender and the raw, honest heat of the Mediterranean sun, that she committed the most radical act of her life. She stopped being a copier and started being a creator. I traveled to see her last spring, not out of a lingering need for a confrontation, but to witness the transcendence for myself. I found her in a stone studio that smelled of turpentine and old wood. She looked different, not because she had aged, but because she had finally inhabited her own skin. The practiced porcelain grace was gone, replaced by a weathered, vibrant authenticity. Her hands were stained with pigment, her hair was a messy knot, and her eyes, once hollow voids of envy, were now bright with the terrifying, joyous light of a woman who had something of her own to say. We didn't talk about the wedding or the diaries. We didn't mention the velvet trap, or the childhood thefts. Those stories belonged to the ghosts we had both outgrown. Instead, we talked about the project that would eventually become our shared legacy. The Written in Light initiative. The collaboration was born from the irony of our parallel tragedies. I provided the technological architecture, a platform designed to help young women document their personal growth and protect their digital identities, and Genevieve provided the soul, an art therapy curriculum focused on finding an original voice in a world of echoes. We were no longer two halves of a fractured whole. We were two distinct architects building a bridge for others who were lost in the same labyrinth of comparison that had nearly swallowed us. As we worked together, I realized the profound cosmic joke of my revenge. That day in the cathedral when I had exposed her secrets to the world, I thought I was dealing a death blow to my enemy. I thought I was destroying her. But in reality, I was performing an act of liberation. By shattering her false narrative, I had stripped away the heavy, suffocating mask she had worn since childhood. I had forced her to stand in the wreckage of her lies until she had no choice but to start writing a story that was actually hers. My revenge wasn't her ruin. It was the catalyst for her birth. Standing in her studio watching her move with a confidence that was entirely unscripted, I felt a sense of transcendence that exceeded any business milestone I had ever reached. We were two women who had survived a war of identity, and we were the only two people in the world who truly understood the cost of authenticity. She wasn't my shadow anymore, and I wasn't her sun. We were simply two stars in the same sky, each burning with our own specific, unrepeatable heat. The childhood trauma that had once bound us in a parasitic embrace had been transformed into a wellspring of empathy. We knew what it felt like to be erased, and that knowledge became the foundation of the work we did to ensure no one else would have to endure that silence. On my final evening in France, we sat on the terrace of her cottage, the valley below us bathed in the gold of the departing sun. Between us on the table sat two books. One was my current journal, a leather-bound record of my life with Julian, the expansion of our foundation, and the quiet joys of a woman who no longer had to look over her shoulder. The other was hers, a messy, paint-stained sketchbook filled with anatomical studies, color palettes, and raw poetic reflections on the nature of light. I looked at them, and the final image of our story crystallized in my mind. For 20 years our diaries had been weapons. Mine had been a shield against her intrusion, and hers had been a blueprint for my replacement. They had been entangled, obsessed with one another, a paper trail of a lifelong haunting. But now, as they lay side by side in the twilight, I saw the ultimate resolution. Her diary was no longer about me. There were no notes on my habits, no rehearsals of my voice, no plans to steal my joy. It was a chronicle of her own becoming, a testament to the fact that she had finally found something more interesting than my life, her own. And mine? Mine was no longer a defensive log of her shadows. It was a celebration of a present that was entirely my own. It's a strange thing, isn't it? Genevieve said, her voice now a low, rich alto that owed nothing to my inflections. To realize that the worst thing you ever did to me was the only thing that could have saved me. We had to lose the story we were told to write, I replied, before we could find the courage to write the one we were meant to live. I left France the next morning, carrying a sense of peace that felt like a permanent climate. Back in Silverport, Julian met me at the airport, his eyes reflecting the same winter sea I had fallen in love with years ago. He didn't ask if I had forgiven her, because he knew that forgiveness was a small word for what had happened between us. We had moved beyond the binary of victim and villain. We had reached a state of authenticity that didn't require the external validation of a social register or a cathedral full of witnesses. Thank you for being part of this story. It is a privilege to tell tales that speak to the soul. Remember, the best story you will ever tell is your own. Live it with courage and truth. I'd love to hear your voice in the comments today. If this story moved you, please subscribe to Queen's Revenge and join us on this path of transformation. Let's keep writing the next chapter together.